doing that today. All right, so that brings us to our feature speaker, Dr. Grady L, who is a professor in crop and soil science. He has taught turfgrass management at NC State since 2006, very well known to extension agents, very well respected by everyone in the turf industry, just an excellent person, and in recognition of his efforts, he was named a Fellow of the American Society of Agronomy, which is the highest honor given by that society, in 2017. And we are very glad and honored to have him here today. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Grady. I'm going to flip to your opening slide, and we look forward to everything you have to share with us about healthy turf care.
So I guess I had to talk button for you to hear me. Everybody can hear me?
We can.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, wonderful. So I'll get started. So Charlotte mentioned a great day for gardeners. I would rather see it be a little warmer rather than just rainy, but it is a great day for our webinar. I'm glad those of you who could join us are on the line. So let me give you a little preview of what we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about overall plant needs, regardless of the plant, but certainly it relates to turf grasses. Then I'll talk to you a little bit about warm and cool season grasses and some of the differences, because in North Carolina we do a lot of work with both of these grasses, and we see a lot of them growing in the landscape. And then we'll talk a bit of time about the best grasses for different areas of the state and different conditions that we encounter in North Carolina, particularly from a species perspective. And we'll mention a little bit about cultivars of these various grasses. And I'm going to talk to you about a couple of specific limitations that I get common questions about, two in particular that I want to address, and then we'll get into the management practices, which is the bulk of today's talk. And we're going to cover the general practices such as mowing, watering or irrigation, nutrition, cultivation, and pest management, and then I'll close off the talk with a few resources that are available to you. But I'm glad Charlotte mentioned the Master Gardener Training book, because I just actually purchased my copy a couple of weeks ago, and it is a great resource and a great book, full color throughout the entire book. It's very pretty and attractive, as well as very informative. So I'm going to be certainly add some slides to some of my talks to encourage people to look at that book, because almost anywhere there's turf grass grown, there's other plants, and vice versa. Even though I realize some of you are not turf people, or maybe would rather see gardens, but still turf is common in our landscapes. So with that, we'll talk about turf today, and hopefully you'll pick up a little bit of information on turf grass. A lot of my talks, I do like to remind people the very basics. So going back to the basics of biology, of what a plant needs to live. And certainly light drives photosynthesis, and while these aspects may be obvious to many of you all, I'm constantly reminding sometimes people the fact that they do not have adequate light, that being sunshine, by which to grow healthy turf grasses. And some of our turf grasses, which I'll go into more specifics later, do require more sunlight than others, and often trees and houses and other structures do cause some issues with turf health. So light's very important. Certainly water, we'll talk about irrigation, oxygen for respiration, that's root respiration. So we'll talk about aerifying the soil, aerifying lawns. So we're addressing some of these needs today in this discussion. Carbon dioxide, which is readily supplied to us in the atmosphere. Mineral nutrients, we'll talk about nutrition. Suitable temperature, which is something that we have not had a great deal of this year so far for our warm season grasses. Warm season, as the name denotes, suggests we need warm weather, and that would be grasses like Bermuda and Zoysia, Centipede, St. Augustine. So we are in good temperatures for our cool season grasses right now. Space, which is usually not a huge issue to deal with in turf, maybe with some of our ornamentals, but not turf. and then being below some tolerance threshold for pest, and we will talk a little bit about pest management towards the end. So these are the basics that all plants need, but certainly they apply to turfgrass plants, so something to kind of keep in the back of our mind as we go through today's program. So I like to start off with, which is better, cool or warm season, and you see two different growth cycles of turfgrass plants. So when you see taller green growth, that's basically when the growth cycle is for warm at the top or a cool season grass at the bottom. And it's very interesting being in the transition zones in North Carolina, and the fact that we do grow both types of grasses, because you move further north, you don't grow the warm season. You move further south, you don't grow a lot of cool season grasses. And both of these grasses respond to temperature, even though they respond differently. They will respond to day length and heat, although they respond differently. So it is important to have a little bit of understanding of which you're growing and whether it's warm season or cool season grasses. And we'll later classify grasses along these two large groups. So this is a picture that's kind of interesting because it's more or less two landscapes, two homes next to each other. Let's see if I can put a pointer here. Let's see, I think you all maybe can see this. So there's obviously along this white fence coming forward would be a property line for the house on the right hand side versus the one that's slightly uphill on the left side. Oh, somebody grabbed the pointer for me. Thank you. So the house on the left, started off obviously with a cool season grass, and the house on the right at some point probably planted a warm season grass. And you can see over time the warm season grass has crept into the cool season grass lawn. And this is something that I commonly see in neighborhoods where we see these mixed warm and cool season grass stands because over time, summer stress, we do see the warm season grass, even though it's dormant when this picture was taken, will outcompete. We have below ground and above ground stems with rhizomes and stolons with some of our warm season grasses. So they tend to be aggressive in invading of our cool season species. So it's not necessarily a good or bad thing, other than the fact that they don't always live in harmony with each other. And if you're trying to maintain a cool season grass, it can be quite challenging without some kind of barrier or some kind of separation between these two. And I unfortunately have gotten involved in several homeowner association arguments because of this sort of point, which is not usually a fun situation. Now, you may say, well, what is the person on the left to do? Well, at this point, they may actually want to team up with their neighbor and actually grab some of their plugs from their neighbor's yard and introduce it to their yard. Let's see. So if you look at this slide, this is actually what has been done. This was one winter. I actually took 2-inch plugs and took it from a warm season area, which is over, on the left or in the foreground, and put 2-inch plugs every 8 feet into what is a typically a cool season or weedy area. And then over time, this was basically the following winter, and then the next slide was actually then the following winter. You can see the warm season grasses is spreading into the cool season grass. And over time, we will develop a warm season lawn in this particular case, with some patience. So warm season grasses, once again, in the summer months, under a little bit of stress, but you maintain them low, they will outcompete our cool season grasses. Now, if the homeowner in the previous two slides, I'm going to go backwards, would have wanted to maintain the cool season grass, then they would have had to have chemically removed the warm season from that stand when it's actively growing, and then reestablished a cool season grass. So obviously some challenges. So here's just a quick slide of taking a plugger or a plug stacker. This is a commercially available plugger which it accumulates plugs in the handle. It's very convenient. I own one of these myself. You can take small plugs and reestablish an area from plugs if you have a warm season grass like zoysia or Bermuda grass in particular. You can see in the lower right hand picture where basically you can establish an entire lawn from plugs if you have some level of patience. The closer you plant the plugs, the more quickly they will fill over time. So just kind of give you a little hint and something you can do to establish a warm season grass. So then you may ask yourself, well, what is the best grass? And of course that's a very relative question. I will tell you, if you move across the state, there is no one grass species suited for all locations. However, in many cases there is a better adapted grass for some given situation. That doesn't mean that year to year we don't see some challenges or some changes in what may work best. I know this year with our warm February and cool March and cool April, we've actually seen some very slow green up and even winter kill of warm season grasses. So this might end up being a year where warm season grasses do not perform as well as cool season, at least so far in this year. So there's no guarantees, as there aren't in any of agriculture, but certainly we have our own challenges with grass selection. I would encourage you all not to encourage your clientele or yourself from buying grasses off of the television or out of the back of your newspaper ads, because in many cases these are very expensive. Grasses do not perform very well. So despite maybe their pitch person or who's advertising these, I would suggest you go obviously with our extension recommendations, not recommendations of a TV personality. So let's talk about some of the individual grasses. As I mentioned, here is kind of your list separated by a dashed line of the cool season, which would be tall fescue or tall fescue with bluegrass. And I saw there was a few people from the mountains area of North Carolina. In some cases you may just plant bluegrass by itself, even though most of the state we often see it mixed with tall fescue. The warm season grasses in the landscape, primarily we see zoysia grass, but we do see some Bermuda grass, particularly in wide open landscapes free of a lot of shade. Centipede grass, particularly popular in the eastern part of the state. St. Augustine has some level of popularity in this area of North Carolina as well as the eastern part of the state. And we do see carpet grass, even though carpet grass is not a very popular grass. It's often in wetter areas. It sometimes has been mixed with centipede grass seed, so you may see it come up in some areas. And I kind of list the last one as a joke, but it's amazing how many times people just mow whatever's available. And they have crabgrass in the summer and then clover in the falls and in the spring months. So if you keep things mowed, it's amazing how uniform it may look, and it will last as a turf for some season of the year. So these are the grasses kind of we're dealing with in North Carolina. And we test a lot of these. Just a kind of a pitch for our testing programs. If you come out to our field day, which is always the second Wednesday of August, this year it would be August the 8th, the earliest it could possibly be. But on August 8th in Raleigh, North Carolina, out on Lake Wheeler Road, we will have a field day. We usually have right around 800 people come out for our annual field day. And we do showcase a number of different species as well as cultivars, as well as some of the other programs, pest control programs, etc., which we'll talk a little bit about today. But at any one given time, we're testing, over 1,000 different cultivars of turf grasses at this particular facility. And this was one of our last tall fescue trials, and you may not realize that, there are hundreds of tall fescue cultivars available to you. But this was just a list of our 2012 through 2017 tall fescue trial, because most of our trials we'll do for 5 years just to see how they perform over a variety of conditions. The interesting thing about tall fescue and also bluegrass is that they are very rarely sold as a single cultivar. They're usually actually mixed together or blended together in the bag. So this is just a seed label from last year, and you can see in this particular bag of tall fescue seed, it had 3 cultivars: Tar Heel 2, Wolfpack 2, and Endeavor 2. So obviously, you know, the seeds probably get to battle it out between the Tar Heels and the Wolfpack, but we all know who wins. But the reality of it is particularly with our cool season grasses, blending is a good thing, and you have genetic diversity and often have a little bit better stress tolerance. The other interesting thing I'd like to point out with this particular bag and this label is something that is relatively new in our industry, and that is coating seed. In this particular case, they're coating it with both a fertilizer as well as a clay-based coating. And this particular bag of seed, if you can see under other ingredients right in the middle of the label, 50% of that bag's contents is actually the coating. And the reason this is important, and important for you to make yourself aware of this and other people that you advise aware of this, is that our seeding rates that we list in our extension publications and our training manuals, etc., give a seeding rate as if you're planting just seed. But in this particular case, if you were buying this bag of tall fescue blended together, you also have 50% non-seed. So your actual seeding rate of this product that's coated would actually have to double to get the same amount of plants established on the grounds. Instead of a 6 pound per thousand seeding rate, you would be planting 12 pounds per thousand per seeding rate. So you may be asking yourself, why are they coating the seed? Well, there is some research that shows some benefit from coating, but the reality of it is, I think the biggest reason seeds are coated today is the fact that it's a little bit cheaper to put a coating in the bag than it is to put seed in the bag. So there's a little bit of marketing involved, even though research has shown some benefit. Probably the larger benefit may be to the companies a little bit more than the person planting the seed. But like I said, there is some benefit. So it's become very common practice in a lot of turf now is to coat the seed. Now there is also coating of seed that's fungicide coating, but that's a little different. This is just another label, and I point this out because it's called a shade mixture. And you may say, what makes it a shade mixture? And the reality of it is the introduction of a fine fescue. In this case, it's razor red fescue. The fine fescues are known to be more shade tolerant. So only 9% of this bag has a fine fescue in it, but because of that, they are calling it a shade mixture. So the reality of it is you know, there's not a huge difference in a lot of our mixtures, because here in this case we have 2 different plant types. We have a fine fescue and then we have tall fescue. But there's not a huge difference, but it's still kind of relabeled and sold, you know, for something to grow into shade with that fine fescue. And this bag actually is also coated, so 50% of it has a coated seed in it. So just kind of things to point out. So turf doesn't always photograph well, and you can't really see looking across this plot, but there's actually 80-something Kentucky bluegrasses grown in this picture. It's a 10,000 square foot block. They're grown in 4x4 blocks. In the lower left-hand corner where it comes to a point, you can see the corner of the plot painted in orange. Now I took this picture in the springtime when everything is green, it's actively growing. You see very little differences in the bluegrasses, even though bluegrasses genetically are very different. If you look at the next picture taken in August, I'm actually at the other corner of the plot, so instead of looking towards the southwest, now I'm looking towards the southeast, and it's painted, all the plots are painted per field day. You can see some of the plots are green in entirety within that square, and some of them are very brown. So in the summer months we have some bluegrasses that are under severe stress, and in many cases we may actually lose some of them from disease and or heat stress. And this is important because for our cool season grasses, particularly bluegrasses, they do suffer a lot in our summer months. So we have developed lists of those grasses that perform better than others. So you can look on our website, which I'll share with you a little bit later, and see which cultivars perform well in our hot, humid conditions. Now, some of these other cultivars may perform very well in other climates, but at least for us, we're at the lower range of adaptation in the U.S. for bluegrasses. So it's important to know which ones do well in our climate. So this is just one of our lists. This is actually the tall fescue list. This is not the latest one, but it's one of the ones just to kind of give you an idea. And sometimes people say, wow, you have a lot of cultivars on your recommended list. And relative it is it's probably less than a quarter of those that we test. So these are the top performing ones from a large number of cultivars that are tested, usually over about a 10 or 15 year period. Some of these do get improvements and are released with the number 2 after them or some other designation, but this is kind of a recommended list. And we put these lists out usually every year in August before the planting season, which for cool season is in September. So just kind of make you aware of some of the information available to you if you're looking for grass cultivars. Now, if you kind of transition over to the warm season grasses, this is just a quick list of warm season zoysia grass cultivars. You can see there's not hundreds of these cultivars available. In fact, there's usually, in most cases, less than a dozen cultivars grown in any given state. And we did a quick poll recently of the neighboring states, and I think North Carolina grows more zoysia grass cultivars than any other state except for Texas. And for some reason, Texas is they like to beat us a little bit on variety of cultivars or number of cultivars. But the zoysia grasses are separated by fine texture and medium texture. So a fine texture would be something in fineness similar to a tall fescue, if you're used to tall fescue, turf-type tall fescue. And a medium texture is more in line with something like a centipede grass or even slightly more coarse than a centipede grass. And I identified the El Toro in red just because this picture is a former backyard of mine, and it is El Toro zoysia grass. But our warm season grasses tend to be obviously creepers, so if you have a lot of flower beds and things like that, or neighbors with cool season grass, they tend to be a little more invasive, lighter green in color, but really withstand the heat and the drought much better than our cool season grasses under most cases. And that doesn't mean they handle the winter really well. They certainly handle the summers very well. And this is just a picture of a front yard. And I like to illustrate this because I know a lot of people in North Carolina really want green grass year-round. But I try to encourage them, if they're selecting a new grass, to at least consider warm season grasses. They don't necessarily have to pick a warm season because they're not always the best grass for the situation. But realizing that it will go dormant, but it's kind of a change of the season, much like the tree. There's actually a maple tree in the center of this picture, and it loses its leaves in the winter, and turf goes brown in the winter if it's a warm season grass. But it's a nice change of season, and I think the brown grass can be very attractive when it's weed-free. And certainly you're not mowing or irrigating and things like that when it's dormant, so it can be a very ecologically friendly turf as well, considering the fact that it's much lower maintenance when it is dormant. And you may say, well, where do you get sod in North Carolina, and how do you find sod? There is a sod growers a group called the North Carolina Sod Producers Association, or NC-SPA, S-P-A, and they have a website, ncsod.org, and you can actually type in the grass you want by species, by cultivar, either way, and hit search, and it will help you identify who grows those grasses. Just understand, like a lot of other plant material, sod is typically trucked into urban areas. So you may have a sod farm down the road from you, or you may have a sod farm that's 100 miles away, but sod is commonly delivered to sites by our sod growers or some contractor working for sod growers. So you don't necessarily have to find one that's right down the road if you're looking for a different grass, but this is an opportunity for you to look at different grasses. So let's talk a little bit more about that turf management aspects, which is the subject of today's talk. And I'm going to use a few different pictures to illustrate situations. In this particular situation, you see a lawn that doesn't have a lot of grass in its backyard. It's actually predominant by trees and some shrubs that don't look overly well maintained. And sometimes people will say, well, I used to have a great yard and now it doesn't look so great. And it goes back to that second slide I shared with you, is you need sunlight to grow any plant, and certainly some of our grasses are sun-loving. Actually, they're all sun-loving, just some of them more than others. Now, when I look at sites like this and I get asked recommendations, I often tell people, well, you're going to have to get more sunlight into this lawn if you want turf. If you don't want turf, then certainly you can look at ground covers and other plant material. This particular house, they did decide to remove a few trees because they wanted grass for their kids to go in their backyard. So if you look at it, it's the same house. They did probably remove a few more trees than I would have, but now they have grass starting to grow in this new establishment. So certainly when you open it up and have good sunlight, the opportunities to grow healthier grass is much increased. Another picture of a backyard, and I hear this quite a few times each year, is I have moss in my backyard. And the green you see in this slide is exactly that. It's predominantly moss. It's not turf grass. There's a few sprigs of grass here and there. But in many cases, once again, people talk about our backyard used to be in a nice lawn, and now we have bare ground or we have moss. And if you have moss, certainly you have more shade than the grass can tolerate, and or you have a combination of shade and wet soils. And people often say, well, if I lime it, will it remove the moss and can I grow turf? And certainly there are steps you can take, but ultimately, you know, you're going to have to get more light into the situation. In many cases, you may have to improve, you know, some drainage. So it's always interesting to me to go to sites and look and hear people talk about living in their house for many years and how it's changed. And another example I like to use, because it's a former house I owned as well, is this particular house I bought in 1995, and you can see I had a little bit of a St. Augustine lawn right in front of the house, a couple of little small oak trees, and you can see 10 years later the oak tree right in front of the house is very large compared to 10 years earlier. And all of a sudden, the turf underneath that tree is not looking as great. It's a little browner, it's a little thinner, and it's just a simple case of shade. The tree's taking advantage of the light, and even though I pruned it and limbed it up, still not adequate sunlight, you know, into that lawn to get good growth. So by 2010, there was no turf in the front yard. It was all ground cover. So the ground cover being able to handle the light deficits or lower light levels much better than the grass. So looking at alternatives. So something to consider. Turf may not be the best plant selection in every situation. If you like grass-like plants, there's certainly some ornamentals, mondo grass and dwarf species of that type of grass that can be grown that looks like turf but can handle the shade, such as we see in this picture. One of the things that I often use when I do site visits is an app for our phones, and don't we love apps for phones? But this is one of the few I've actually paid for. It's called Sunseeker, and you can use Sunseeker on your phone to actually look at how much sunlight you get at different times of the day. So I can go out to a site, point my phone into the sky, and tell where the sun would be at 7 in the morning, 8 in the morning, 9 in the morning. With the solstices early in the year, late in the year, and just basically predict how many hours of sunlight a turf may receive. It would be a very useful app to try to help explain to people why their turf is not doing so well, because I would say probably the top 1 or 2 problems I see in turf outside of pest are inadequate sunlight to grow the grass. So something to keep in mind. So light was one of the issues I wanted to specifically address, and the other specific issue I want to address, because I get this question a lot, is what's the best grass when I have a dog? And in this particular case, it's a big dog that stays outside, and it digs, and it has paths around the trail or around the fence. And certainly there's different types of damages that pets can cause, but certainly if you have an animal outside that's a large that likes to dig and run into the same path, then you need a grass that can recover from that type of injury very quickly. And if you have full sun, certainly a quick-growing warm season grass will be probably the best turf, but if you have too much light, then it may not. So there's no one given situation. You have to decide what's the most limiting factor. Is it sunlight or is it the pet? In many cases, it can be one or the other. But I also see issues with smaller pets that maybe stay in the house most of the day. They come out during the day and they use the lawn as basically their restroom. And then we see issues with turf grass, with damage from the urine from the animal. And certainly, if you look at the upper left-hand picture, pretty commonly common spots we call dog spots sometimes, where we see a high urine concentration causing some burning or desiccation of the turf right outside of that ring. We may actually see a fertilizer response, and then certainly an unaffected area. Now, what to do with these? Certainly, some grasses handle this better than others. Ironically, actually, a cool season grass, tall fescue, has been shown to handle urine stains better than the warm season grasses. Even though we think of warm season grasses as being more salt tolerant, they actually don't handle the urine quite as well as tall fescue. The other thing you can do, or two other things you can do, one is you can use a mat, like a training mat, like you see in the lower right-hand corner, to train the animal to go on one spot. And or if you want to let them go into the lawn or the turf areas, is to keep it more heavily fertilized. And actually that kind of masks the symptoms much better than if it's a weakly fertilized or poor quality turf. So upping the maintenance practices can really help. I get a lot of questions about dogs, animals' interactions with turf grasses. So I want to certainly address light and pets, kind of head on pretty early here. So let's talk a little bit about other maintenance practices. And certainly, no matter what we do to the turf grass, it has opportunities to affect turf health. So something to keep in mind. And we can have turf that is low input or no input. And this goes back to an earlier picture of a side yard I used to have. And when I bought the house, there was no input, and I just changed it to what I would call low input, where it was mowed every 3 or 4 weeks, and it was a shady area. So I didn't expect to have pristine turf in that area, but I wanted something green and some cover, away from the house. So we sometimes have to judge how much inputs we want to put into that turf. And I like this picture because it's a very beautiful plantation home, but they chose to have very small turf areas right near the entrances that were highly maintained, but the rest of the lawn and landscape actually had very low maintenance. So we can often choose to maintain different areas differently as well. There's a number of different programs, and I'll talk about these in general, but this is one that's an EPA government program called Greenscapes, but we use a lot of the same principles in our extension publications, but basically looking at our soil health, picking the right plant, which we've talked a little bit about turf selection, good watering practices, careful pest management, and doing as much natural lawn care as possible. So I'll touch upon some of these, but also if you look at our Turf Files website, we have a lot of resources there. This is actually an older screenshot. We've now moved to the extension portal. We still use the same same web address, but it does have a more consistent look with the other extension portals you've probably grown accustomed to seeing now. But you can go through there and look at a lot of our educational material or publications, for advice. And certainly, no matter what, soil preparation is at the heart of a good, healthy turf grass. And I see this time and time again, many cases in new neighborhoods. The soil is not very well prepared. It's scraped off. They lay sod on the top, and then we constantly see struggles for some period of time afterwards. But certainly, alleviating compaction, making adjustments to pH and fertilization, very, very important for long-term success rather than failure of the plant. And certainly I think any goal for us should be to reduce water and chemical use. It saves money, also reduces our environmental impact. Turf should be in harmony with the environment, not against the environment. Now I'll just reference Carolina Lawns, which is another great resource, very similar to your Chapter 9 and your Master Gardener training publication. And this is an old screenshot, but you can see the table of contents, which is why I continue to use it. Pretty much is that A to Z, how to maintain, how to select and establish turf grasses. And this can be downloaded free from our Turf Files website and received. So let's talk about some of the specific maintenances. And I mentioned the first one we talk about would be mowing. And we do encourage people to mow as tall as possible with the stipulation of what grass you're growing, but certainly being at the top end of our mowing height, because there is a relationship between deeper rooting and taller mowing, and deeper rooting almost always results in a healthier plant and a plant more resistant to drought stress. So choosing our mowing height appropriate to the grass species, and this is in a number of our publications. I have made some changes just to make people aware that in many cases we're suggesting a taller mowing height rather than a shorter mowing height. But you can see a lot of these 2, 3, 4 inches depending upon the species. Tall fescue 3.5 to 4 inches would be appropriate, and in many cases that's going to provide a more drought tolerant turf. This is an interesting picture because we use the same mower, but when we're doing this particular trial, we set it up on the right a ½ inch lower than what we intended. And you can see when you mow off too much material at one cutting, the kind of debris you can leave and the kind of damage you can do to the grass with just a ½ inch difference. So on the left, you can see where we reset up the mower and set it, and you see almost no accumulated thatch or debris on the surface, and a very nice quality of cut. And we're actually doing quality of cut research in this particular picture. So mower setup is very important. Whether you're mowing and using your own mower or whether you're working with a landscape contractor who's going to be doing mowing for us, but spending some time to make sure you're at an appropriate mowing height, and then also making sure that you're mowing often enough for the growth rate of the grass. And that is one of the downsides to warm season grasses like Bermuda and Zoysia. If you're keeping the fertility level up because of a pet or just because you like the look, and it's getting rainfall and it's hot in the summer months, you're going to have to mow more frequently, some cases more than once a week, to minimize scalping and minimize damage. Well, this slide got a little bit messed up. I think we can still understand the concept. You have 4 different bars here. And this is basically mowing height of tall fescue and crabgrass incidence. I like to use this slide. One of Dr. Fred Yelverton's students did this work a number of years ago. But there's a direct relationship between mowing height of tall fescue and the amount of crabgrass that lawn will have growing in it in the summer months. So if you were mowing at 1 inch, which is the left bar, it was 79% crabgrass, 2 inches 74%, 3 inches 31% crabgrass, and at 4 inch height, basically no crabgrass. The only difference in these plots were mowing heights. So that's not to say if you mow at 4 inches you'll never have crabgrass, but if you have a thick stand of tall fescue that's not getting light to the soil surface because you're mowing higher and it's dense, the odds are you're not going to have hardly any crabgrass. So very, very important to use a proper mowing height to minimize weeds. Also, I mentioned setup of mowers, having a sharp mower versus a dull mower. You can see the difference in the quality of cut. You can imagine disease opportunities and also drying of the leaf, letting moisture out of that jagged edge versus a sharp mower can be very important. So maintaining your equipment can be important. And also note recycled clippings. Do not remove the clippings from the site. Let them lie in their place. They do not contribute to thatch. So no matter how you mow or how inventive you are, certainly using good mowing practices can be very important. As you can see, this person trying to be more efficient with multiple mowers. Let's talk a little bit about irrigation. And I realize a couple people mentioned we're going fast. I don't want to run out of time without still covering some points, and I think we have plenty of time, but this will be available for you to view later. But certainly smart watering. If you do have an irrigation system, become familiar with its operation. Also know a little bit about how you can use deficit irrigation, because we don't need to supply all the water that is lost through ET with ever watering. In many cases it makes sense to allow the soil to dry out, to have a reservoir for when we do have rain. And also I'll introduce the concept of smart controllers here briefly. Have a rain shutoff device. Absolute must. You don't want water being wasted. So very easy to install. These can be purchased for usually about 25 to 35 bucks and can be installed in most systems. Now I want to show you this controller on the right side. It's what we call a smart controller. And in this particular controller you actually enter in the soil type, the plant type, the sprinkler type, and your zip code. And the zip code basically gives you latitude, longitude, so it can use historical data to actually adjust climatically for historical weather conditions. Now this is a self-contained smart controller, and in many cases you can use that, or you can actually use what we call an add-on controller, so that you have some type of sensor was wired back to a module, which is then wired into your existing controller. So once again, this is an ET controller. It's using feedback of weather conditions to make adjustments for irrigation. So it may be reducing your irrigation or increasing your irrigation, depending upon what the needs are based on climatic conditions. Now, we've done a lot of research with these. This is not an ET type, but this is actually a soil moisture sensor. Same way, it's wired back to a module, wired into a controller. And these particular controllers basically are there to help you save water. And we've done research with these for years with the soil moisture sensor and ET sensor, savings upwards to about 50% roughly of your irrigation output. Even the rain sensor during a very dry year was saving 5 to 15% compared to just using a timer and not having some way to adjust. So very important to use technology with irrigation. Now, if you don't have a smart controller, there are some resources available to you. And I did not put in the new screenshot, but go to Turffile's website, and there is a publication called Water Requirements of North Carolina Turf Grasses. It's AG 661. We just revised it this year. It's up on the extension portal and on our website. And what that does is basically uses your irrigation requirements for different regions of North Carolina. We've actually improved it such that we take the irrigation requirements and we've calculated run times for irrigation systems. So while I calculated this run time to be 22 minutes, we've actually gone through the math for you, and we've added multiple tables in there to help people set up irrigation controllers to use historical long-term weather averages to basically improve their system. So we're trying to be the smart controller for you, or help people make seasonal adjustments or monthly adjustments to their irrigation to save water. So there's other opportunities using some of these resources to help you manage your irrigation system. So this is, once again, practicing lateral lawn care. We talked about mowing, fertility, water. Certainly, soil tests, very important. You all are plant people and you work with plant people. and you realize the importance of soil testing. It is free most of the year, and encourage people to take advantage of what may be one of the last states in the country that offer free soil testing for recommendations. Soil testing is certainly important for P and K and lime needs, and then certainly moving away from that, dealing with aerification and also using organic products is a part of a good soil management. Just to kind of illustrate the importance of soil testing, if you can see inside this red box in the top picture, that was a phosphorus deficient soil with phosphorus being applied, and in that same soil, phosphorus deficient soil with phosphorus not being applied, and you can see within that red box we saw basically no turf growth 52 days after it was planted, whereas with phosphorus we had good turf growth 52 days after planting. So just illustrates the importance of nutrients when they are limiting. It doesn't matter how much other nutrients you add. If you have a limiting nutrient, you can still not get adequate plant growth. And we have recommendations on a number of different publications on target pHs, amount of nutrients to add per application, and how many times per year. As kind of a calendar format or as a total format, things like Carolina Lawns, also in your Master Gardener training book, offers these types of tables to help you make good nutrient management decisions. Cultivation certainly can be very important, and when I talk cultivation of turf, that's when it's actively growing and we're coming in and pulling cores or aerifying, or we're removing thatch or power raking. Now, the equipment is done basically to remove this organic layer. You can see in this particular turf along the edge of an asphalt area that it's raised, or really an organic layer above the soil. And if this gets to be as bad as in this picture, you often see thinning turf, and it harbors a lot of disease inoculum and insects. And you may need to go in there and either core aerify or dethatch with equipment. Now, you can do this to some extent preventatively, but we often do it curatively. And just because you have turf doesn't mean it needs to be dethatched, every year. It's something that we often do infrequently. Tall fescue we do often renovate on an annual basis if it thins out during the summer. So a lot of times there's management calls or judgment calls of when we may need to do these practices. You can see here where the roots are growing is where it was aerified, so very important to get air to those roots. When you do that, well, cool season grass, spring or fall, warm season grass, spring through midsummer. So if you go back to that earlier picture, certainly timing is very important. If you have a cool or warm season grass, we do adjust when we do things by season with different grass types. So certainly when it deals with using pesticides, as I always advise people, follow the label, calibrate your applicator and also the equipment you're applying with, and treat areas only when practical. So very important to only treat those areas that you really want to treat or need treated. And certainly know what you're treating. We have resources on turf files to help you identify your weeds. If you're going to use a herbicide, some of them are only active with certain weed species, so it is important to have some knowledge of weed species if you are going to apply with a herbicide. And if you're applying for insects, in many cases we have threshold levels for different insects. So just because you see an insect doesn't mean you necessarily need to treat for it. Like anything else, the plant has a tolerance for some level of activity. So having a little bit of a thought process of do I need to treat at this point or not can be very important. And some of the information like this is available through various resources, etc. Kind of the last little section here, last few slides, I just want to mention this because I hear this over and over again in this area of the state is I used to have tall fescue and I had brown patch or gray leaf spot or Pythium blight. And I would say that each turf species has its own fungal problems. And certainly tall fescue is well known for being brown patch intolerant and getting lesions and problems in the summer months. So a lot of times people have switched to warm season grasses and then they're surprised when they get a disease. And the reality of it is we see diseases different times of the year for warm season versus cool, but in many cases they're the same causal agent. So what caused brown patch and tall fescue causes large patch and zoysia grass, as you see in this picture on the right. So none of our turfgrass species are immune to fungal problems. That doesn't mean you're going to have them every year, but in some cases you may get them to a situation where you need to treat, and this is a large patch in a St. Augustine lawn. You see it can be pretty devastating and be pretty unsightly. We don't often see widespread death due to disease in warm season grasses, but occasionally we do. So it's important to know a little bit about what to do with diseases. And in with a couple of slides of resources. Certainly our pathology, turf pathology operates a diagnostic clinic, and they will ID insects as well as disease and pathology clinic doing the disease aspects. And there's some great videos on there to how to submit samples and get things positively identified. So I advise you to investigate some of the resources and use them. And in many cases, these are linked to our Turf Files website, which I think it was popped up there a little bit earlier. So I want to make you also aware of both my email address as well as Turf Files. And I'm not sure if I'm supposed to try to go through and answer the chat room questions, or we'll spend some time with that, or what. But I do see several questions there.
I think we can take a minute to answer a couple of questions. I see that question about what can we do to build topsoil in our yards. What do you recommend for that?
Okay, to build topsoil in a yard, certainly turf grasses actually collect a lot of dust and will build soil on its own over time. We see that quite frequently. If you want to add a better topsoil and or use a compost material, a lot of people will top dress with the compost, and we have some commercial suppliers of compost in the state that have good materials, so you can certainly do that as well. But probably most people would be either top dressing with a better soil than they have. They have like a red clay and want a topsoil, or using a commercially available compost source. Okay, to go down, somebody said turf grass essentially provides the ecological dead zone. Can you suggest native grasses or other native plants to use as a mixed species lawn? I'm not sure I totally agree with the ecological dead zone, but some of our grasses are very well adapted, and they have reclassified some of our grasses as being likely to be native. So the word native grasses is a little bit ambiguous how it's defined. It depends upon who's defining it. I would also say that we don't have any true native turf grasses to this region of the United States that would be suitable to be used as we are used to using turf grasses, and that is a mown area that is subject to traffic and wear. There are native grasses that are more bunchy in nature that would be more of an ornamental type of grass, not necessarily mown and used as a turf grass. We also are looking at some broadleaf plant material to be used as lawns, yarrow and some microclovers. We are doing some research in that area on a limited basis, realizing that's not for everyone, but there are some opportunities now with some of our companies to provide some alternative plant materials for turf that are not grasses.
All right, thank you. I actually seeded
an
area with some microclover and fescue in the fall over a partially shaded septic area. I've been pretty happy with how it's come up.
Yeah,
and I think people are asking about.
Done pretty well.
I'm sorry, if you could repeat that question.
I was just going to say that, yeah, some of the microclovers seem to do pretty well in our climate, even though in the summer they don't do so well, but then the tall fescue kind of hopefully shines. So Sharon asked, do you recommend white clover to be added to lawns to serve as a way to add nitrogen to the lawn? I generally don't do that because white clover can get to be so aggressive it tends to show up then everywhere. If you have beds and things like that, before you know it, you have clover, overtaking your landscape, not just the lawn, but also other beds, because it is pretty aggressive when it's actively growing. Even though if you don't mind clover, it will attract a lot of bees to your landscape and lawn. So it's, some people don't mind the clover. Some people, obviously it's a broadleaf plant, and if you were to put out any broadleaf herbicides, it could damage the clover. So I guess there's pros and cons, different ways to looking at it.
All right. I think the other question was about sharing the content. Do you plan to post these slides on TurfFile's website?
We just switched to the extension portal. I haven't posted a lot of slides of recently, just because of the changes we've made to TurfFiles, and I don't have the capacity yet myself to post there. My understanding is this video is available, so I assume that they could continue to see these, and many of these slides are probably already on TurfFiles, but I may look to see the possibilities of posting this. I can, at least.
All right, thank you. And I know people wanted the web addresses, and I will follow up with those and send out all the web addresses, the great resources that Grady shared. And so if sorry, I think I turned my sound off. I will share them if you're subscribed to the MGV listserv, which I've just put the link on how you can subscribe in the chat box. I will send out those links that he shared to that list, as well as to the agent list, so they can share it with you as well. So I just want to say thank you, Grady. We really appreciate you joining us this morning and sharing all this great information about how we can have healthy lawns, emphasizing it does go back to soil preparation, it goes back to expectations about your lawn and choosing the right variety for your area, and mowing height. That one is one that always, every time I hear it, it's like, oh yeah, that is really important. So those are things we all need to know and need to emphasize when we're talking to people about turf problems.
Yeah, Charlotte, if I could, let me go back. If I scroll back up, and I did miss some of the questions because I was giving the talk and didn't notice them coming in, but someone asked how to eliminate warm season grass creeping into cool season grass. And to be honest, they're going to have to put up a barrier of some sort to keep that from happening. Our spray, kind of at the front of its movement with a non-selective herbicide. There is no other really good way of doing that other than a barrier, or really killing that area and keeping that killed. And then somebody asked what species of warm season grass this was, and obviously that was specific to a slide, and I apologize, I didn't notice the question, so I'm not sure what slide. The next person suggested it was probably zoysia, and if it was a turf with a home showing in it, it probably was zoysia, but I apologize, I didn't notice when they asked that question.
All right, yes, thank you.
So I just want to make those points.
Yes, thank you for going back and catching those. All right, so thank you, Grady, and like I said, if you sign up for the Master Gardener email list, I will be sharing those resources that Grady has mentioned, and many wonderful resources he's mentioned. But now I think we're going to move over to Mike Munster and Matt Bertone and hear about current issues in pests and diseases.
All right, thanks, Charlotte. Well, I'm going to go up first, and Mike will follow me. So today I'm going to continue talking about mites. I talked about the non-plant feeding mites last time, and just as a refresher for anybody who hasn't been here, mites are arachnids, so they're related to spiders and scorpions and harvestmen, things like that. They're very taxonomically complicated and very small organisms, usually about 1 millimeter long, but range from 1/10 of a millimeter to up to 2 centimeters. They are likely the most ecologically diverse group of animals. Perhaps nematodes might be more diverse, but we're not sure, and have various biologies and reproductive strategies. And the soil contains numerous individuals, but as we're going to see here, there are many types of individuals on plants and whatnot. Okay, so let's get into some of the plant feeding ones, and we'll start from the bottom. So there are a lot of mites in the soil, like I said, and that's where the plants interface with it. And because of this, there are some actual specialists on bulbs and roots of plants. So bulb mites are some types of Acaridae. There's a few genera that can affect bulbs and roots of plants. Often attack things like garlic, onion, and flower bulbs, things with large storage systems, things like that. Their damage, their feeding can actually facilitate infection from rots. Water gets in, rotting occurs, and then you can actually get other types of mites in there. Now, one of the things that is difficult about this situation is that when we often get these plants into the clinic, there will be mites present, but it's a question of what came first. So if a rot comes in first through some other means and ways, then some types of acarids that are very similar looking to the primary pest, root and bulb mites, can come in to feed on the rot. And so basically I have to slide mount them, look at the identification to see whether they're likely a primary pest or not. Actually in this photo you can see these large white ball-shaped mites with these little red legs. Also note that all these little things are baby mites, so they can be quite common in pockets of the bulbs and the roots. So keep in mind that that can happen. There are not many. It doesn't happen very often. We don't get a lot of cases of these primary mite pests in the clinic, but just know that if you're having declines in some types of bulb or large root type plants, especially herbaceous plants, and it could be mites. Okay, now on to some of the more aerial forms. So, spider mites. Spider mites are one of the most common groups of mites on plants. And, I should mention that it is actually weird that mites can be plant feeders, because most other arachnids, almost all other arachnids, are either predators or scavengers. So mites really branched out, no pun intended, to go to the leaves and other parts of the plant and feed on them. Spider mites are one of the most common groups of plant-feeding mites. They're in the family Tetranicidae, and they're small, of course, about 1 millimeter long, and spider-like mites. Now, species ID is fairly difficult. I'm going to go over some that are pretty easy to identify by host or whatnot, but even when you see them, it's tough to tell exactly which species you have sometimes. Some come in different color forms. There are different life stages that can look different. So anyway, I'm going to try and just give a general identification and just some general groups. Now, some create webbing. This is one of the major ways they get their name. And you can see down here in this picture, there's some webbing on this tip of this apple tree. Now that usually only occurs in certain situations, especially when it's very dry, or indoor plants, things like that. Feeding often causes stippling damage, bronzing, and other types of symptoms. Now the eggs are distinct, and this actually can be an easier way sometimes to identify which type of spider mite you have. They can either be globular and smooth or somewhat flattened, sometimes with little ridges and textures, and they can be with or without a little hair on the top, which is called the stipe. And many of them have many generations per year. Now, here's a picture just showing again why they're called spider mites. This is in high infestations. They start to create silk. The silk is actually produced from their palps, which are the little non-walking legs near the mouth. They have a little spigot, and you can see actually on this plant, I believe this was a tomato, that basically you can see these yellow stippling and bronzing of the stem where there's lots of mite feeding and activity. And you can see even within the webbing there's eggs and young and shed skins. And actually shed skins and eggs, or even just egg shells, can be a good way to determine that you've had mites even if they're not present and in large colonies at the moment. Okay, so two-spotted spider mite is the most common spider mite around. Tetranicus urticae is the name. They have a wide host range, mostly broadleaf plants. Very common, especially in the greenhouses or indoors. Though in fields they can be common as well. We see them in strawberries that come in from field situations and in the right conditions. And it's usually a little bit drier conditions that are more tolerated by the spider mites. Humid conditions actually keep the populations down a little bit. Now they are pale with 2 dark patches. You can see the dark patches on the sides. Now note that there are other similar looking spider mites. And there's also, though, a red form of the 2-spotted spider mite. So it is sometimes difficult to tell this red 2-spotted spider mites from other red spider mites, which we'll see in a moment. The eggs are smooth and shiny. They're usually kind of cream colored until they start to develop a little more. That's because the mite is a fairly pale mite. So if you see a smooth egg that doesn't have any little hair or stipe, which you'll see in a moment, on it, that's going to be a good indication of 2-spotted spider mites. Now they will again produce large amounts of silk in the right conditions. You know, I notice that when you bring in a plant from outside over the winter, you'll get a huge burst of population of spider mites because the indoors are much drier than the outdoors. There are fewer predators, things like that. Okay, boxwood spider mite. This is a very common pest of boxwoods. Many of the boxwood plants we get in have damage from boxwood spider mites. They are especially bad on European American. Apparently Japanese boxwood are not as well attacked by boxwood spider mites. They overwinter as eggs and are active very early, and then apparently they're gone. It wasn't until last January that I was able to get this photo down here of a male long-legged boxwood mite with its eggs. Its eggs are actually a little bit more flattened, almost disc-shaped. But basically, once they're gone, the damage still is shown. And this is when we diagnose boxwood spider mites as the cause. And so they'll cause the stippling damage, and this is a much more high-density case. But if you see here, this is a much better representation of it. Sometimes a very green and vibrant looking boxwood, you'll get these little, looks like somebody almost took a little toothpick or something and scraped little lines of yellow into it. And that's a good indication that you've got boxwood spider mites. Again, I rarely ever see the actual mites. You'll often, if you see this damage, you can flip over the leaves and look, and you sometimes see shed skins and eggshells, but you rarely ever see the actual mites. And so it's just a good indication to basically check and treat the next year, or keep monitoring for the actual mite activity and get them early in the season. Some of these areas can be pruned out to help reduce the populations or any of the affected areas, but there's really not much to do after there's high densities and high damage. Okay, spruce spider mites. Spruce spider mites are a very common one on conifers. They are one of the most serious pests and can actually kill smaller plants. They are reddish in color, and their eggs have a stipe. It's a little, you can see it here, it's got a little shiny egg with red. They're very red mites, and you can see this little hair on the tip. That's actually when the female lays the egg and she pulls away from it, she leaves this little kind of hair-like structure. And again, a regular 2-spotted spider mite would not have that. They are typically on many coniferous hosts that people plant in their yards, especially arborvitae, leyland, Japanese cedar, but also spruce, juniper, hemlock, pine, Douglas fir, and others. Now they do cause chlorosis on the needles. You can see this yellowing area of the needles is very common on the feeding. Basically, most of these mites are sucking contents out of the cells of the plant, and so they're sucking the green directly out of it, and multiple feedings, multiple individuals will cause this bronzing or yellowing to happen. And in spruce spider mites, high mortality can happen when there's lots of mites on young plants. They can overwhelm a plant. Now, one of the things I've read about is that you can actually, if you're curious about spruce spider mites, you have these types of plants that are affected by spruce spider mites, you can always go out and kind of take a branch and beat it against a piece of paper. Even though these are very tiny arthropods, you can see little kind of dots moving around on the piece of paper, and that can give you an idea of the density that you're seeing. But again, a lot of these mites are so small, you'll need at least a hand lens to see the presence. And again, here's actually some a good visual of the shed skins and the eggshells once they've hatched. Okay, there are other red mites. These are still, again, spider mites, but they are not two-spotted spider mites than the other ones. There are a couple of species of Panonicus. Citri and Omi are the most common ones. They have these wart-like bases to the setae, so they almost look like porcupines, and it looks like a little, almost like goosebumps on their body. The citrus red mite is overall red. The European red mite, basically these warts, instead of being red like this citrus one here, will be white. Much like this one below, but this one doesn't have the warts. Now, the European red mite is found on various fruit trees especially. That's one of the most common places you can find them, especially rosaceous hosts, apple, cherry, things like that. And also other deciduous trees, but they're fairly generalist. Citri can be on citrus, but also on other broadleaf plants, and most of the time these are going to be on woody plants, and so they can be common. Probably not. I don't see them as commonly as two-spotted spider mite on certain things, but they can be an issue. Now, below, this is the southern red mite, Ligonicus illicus, and this attacks a wide variety of hosts. This is a female. I like this one, I think, because it's got this little white heart on the back. But they're very difficult to identify, and the color variation is pretty high, and so just going by color may be difficult sometimes. Okay, so moving out of the spider mites, a close relative family are the flat mites. These are also sometimes called the false spider mites. The Teniopalpidae is the name of the family. They are fairly diverse and some very serious pests, especially in the tropics. But basically they look like a spider mite that's been stepped on, so it is naturally that flat. They also typically have this kind of finger print pattern on them, and it's hard to see here, but they basically have a very nice line or groove across the body that you can see under on slides or under high magnification. Another thing they tend to have is these flattened setae, little kind of scale-like setae on the body, rather than the long hair-like setae that true spider mites have. They're fairly small, and they actually found out only fairly recently through high magnification SEMs and things like that, that they actually feed through the stomates of the plant. So they don't actually pierce the plant in typical fashion. They go for the very soft lining and the soft inside of the stomates. Now, the damage is usually in the form of stippling patterns on the plant. But I've more often see them as an issue in indoor and greenhouse situations. They can be rather cryptic, more so than spider mites, because they don't attain huge colonies, they don't create the silk, and they may be, hiding along the mid-vein, hiding along little crevices and cracks. And like I said, they're a little cryptic because they sit still pretty well. Now, their eggs are less round than spider mite eggs, but very small, of course. Now, there is a genus called Pentamerismus, which is a small red flat mite that's on conifers, especially cypresses. So you can actually find them sometimes along with spruce spider mites, but they're basically these small, flat, very bright red. And if you look at them under high magnification, you actually see the same, very similar flat scales around the rump. And these go kind of hide in little cracks and crevices in the plant near the needles. They're actually one of my favorites. I think I just like how they look for some reason. Okay, so out of the flat mites, these are kind of the spider mite-like type mites. Tarsonemid mites. So we talked about these last time. The family Tarsonemidea. They are extremely diverse family that feed on all different things. So we're going to be talking about the plant feeding species this time, of course, but last time I noted that the bee tracheal mite. So there are a couple of these tarsinemids that live either on the external body parts or in the breathing tubes of honeybees, and can be a serious pest where they live and clog up and help or disrupt respiration. Well, tarsinemids are really diverse and do a lot of different things. So in general, they are kind of very small, much smaller than a typical spider mite, about half a millimeter long or so. Males have these large hind legs that are claw-like, and the females have these whip-like hind legs. So that's how you can tell the sex. Now, they're usually produced in almost more than a 10-to-1 ratio, females to males, and much more females than the males produce usually. And the damage is often diagnostic. Now, broad mites, which I'll talk about in the next slide, Polyphaga tarsinemus latus, are fast, shiny, and shaped like a football, and have very distinct eggs. Other tarsinema pests include the cyclamen mite, which is this one. Under the scope, you'd be able to see this flange on the male hind leg, but I don't expect any of you to ever see that unless you look at pictures online. But they also have a fairly smooth egg, and actually very smooth egg compared to broad mites, which we'll see in a minute. They are on various hosts, and one thing to note is that there are also species that feed on fungi, and so this is where it comes. It's like the bulb mites, where if a plant has some kind of fungus on it, oftentimes when we leave the plant's materials in moist chambers here to try and coax out diseases, we will get huge explosions of tarsinemid mites that are typically there in low numbers, but because of the fungus that they're feeding on, will blow up and explode. So it's hard to judge whether it's a pest of the plant directly or feeding on fungus. But luckily, the one major species that attacks plants, especially in greenhouses, but can be found all over, are broad mites. And like I said, they're very, very distinct. So the most distinct thing is their egg. The egg is large. It's almost the size of the female, and they have all these little knob-like structures all over them. So they look, I think, like some kind of artistic glass-blown egg. Most other tarsinemid eggs are going to be smooth, about the same shape, oblong, but fairly circular, very smooth. The female broad mites are, like I said, shiny, oblong, and they usually have a lighter stripe down the back. Males here are faster, active, and they actually have these enlarged hind legs and are a little bit more broad in size. Now, one thing to note about tarsinemids that's kind of interesting is that the males actually, when they do exist, they actually go and grab females that are just about to become mature and carry them around on their back legs and take them to a spot where they let them molt and then become sexually active, and then they mate with them right away. So you can actually find them in high infestations, the males dragging around the females, carrying them around above their body, which is kind of weird. But otherwise, broad mites are really an issue because their saliva is toxic to plants. It'll cause distortion in plant parts, especially the new growth. For instance, here's a daisy that has fairly all-right older growth, but after an infestation, you see these curled, very rough, thickened leaves on the new growth. Anybody want to guess? Some people have seen my presentations before, but anybody know what host this is? Feel free to type it or whatnot. So this is one you probably have in your yards. Hey, people got it. Yeah, it is hydrangea. But you can see how these leaves are not at all like a typical hydrangea leaf. And even some of the flowers have been curled and puckered. So very difficult obviously the cell plant like that, and the mites will cause this type of issue. We do often see them most of the time in greenhouse situations or indoor situations, but they can become issues out in the field as well. Okay, area-fied mites. So these mites are very, very small, 1/10 to 1/3 of a millimeter typically. So again, very small. So for instance, here is this bald cypress frond. Basically, this is where the needles are coming off of. And you can see the contortions, and that's caused by these little tiny white things, which are the mites. Now they elongate. I think I could describe them as ice cream cone shaped. They look actually like ice cream cones. But where the ice cream would go, you actually have the mite head and 4 legs only. So unlike almost all other arachnids, these as adults have 4 legs. Basically, you're not really going to see that though because they are so tiny. They can be gall makers or vagrants. So vagrants kind of just walk around on the plants and feed externally. Others make galls. They can move on the wind or on wildlife. They can actually crawl on the legs and the fur of squirrels and then on the legs of birds. Most are very host specific, either to a genus or family. Very rarely are they generalists. And many cause issues on their hosts, including distortion of growth, russeting, and various galls. You can see these needles and these little these orange spots are not natural to the bald cypress there. Okay, so just going over a couple of them very quickly. Well, first, this is my other favorite question to ask. What is this? What plant is this? So beet, okay. Any other guesses? Spinach, okay. Chard, yeah. Okay, those are the typical answers. The answer though is poplar. So this is how bad it can get actually. And so on the surface of this leaf, this is actually a research plot. On the surface of the leaves are these thousands of little tiny area-fied mites, which you can't see at this magnification. But of course, this is what the leaves should look like. Their saliva is toxic and will cause this distortion in the growth. Okay, so there are lots of different plants, wild plants, and yard plants that may be affected by gall-making area-fieds. One that I like is this Nissa. It's a black gum, gets these 2 distinct groups, 2 distinct species. Leaf edge rolling gall maker right here, Area-Fides dinus, and pock bladder gall, Aceria nissi. So, and you can see if you cut open these pock galls, you'll see these little orange mites inside. They don't really hurt the plant much. They're more aesthetically damaging. The plants usually can tolerate some of it. But other hosts of different species can be maples. There's some on linden. There's one on beech. And other types of plants. So many of these little tiny galls can be caused by area-fied mites. Okay, rosette virus is actually transmitted by an area-fied mite. So it's windblown typically by Phylacoptes fructiphilus. So in this regard, when we get a sample in, we can't definitively test for the virus, but oftentimes Mike or whoever will pass me the plant, and I'll look for the mites, these tiny mites in the axils of the new growth. And I'm not sure if Mike wants to chime in for a second and talk about anything relating to the virus.
I will actually mention that briefly in the section on BOLOs when I get to my BOLOs.
Okay. Yeah. So we won't go on with this much, but you can see some of the symptoms here. Again, the mites are very small and difficult to find generally, but it is transmitted by a mite and is windblown, unfortunately. Okay. Bermuda grass mite. This was one that we found last year. It can be somewhat common. It's called a witch's broom. Yes, so there's any growth like that, It's kind of called a witch's broom, and actually in this case also the Bermuda grass mite, we would call it a witch's broom as well. So it's a non-native mite that came to America in the mid-1900s. It's found in the sheaths and creates a witch's broom. So there's very short internodes and these very rosette kind of witch's broom of the grass. The damage is worse in hot, dry conditions and can resemble other issues. But basically, if you pull back the sheaths, you'll see all the little eggs and these long worm-like mites, which are again eriophyid mites. Treatments. Well, I'll talk just very briefly about a couple of treatments, but it all depends on the type of mite. And it depends on how common it is. So we can speak specifically if you'd like. If you're having an issue with specific mite, we can get you some information, but it all depends. Okay, just trying to move on so Mike has some time. Boxwood bud mite, this was actually a new one for me. I contacted Jim Baker, emeritus professor here. He said he found them once in 1980 and sent me the photo. But we actually got in a sample of boxwood a couple weeks ago that actually Sean Butler, the homeowner pathologist, noticed the mites, and I was looking for boxwood spider mites when he mentioned it, but actually it's these little tiny mites on the buds, and you can see they start to distort the growth, and you get these curled buds that then house all these mites. They're not very common, but can cause the new growth to curl and distort. So if you see that on a boxwood, definitely check inside for these little colonies of worm-like mites. Tomato russet mite. This is attacks tomatoes and other solanaceous crops. Typical in greenhouses. I looked at most of our samples from greenhouses. So if you're growing anything indoors, they may be affected. They work from the bottom up and cause leaf curling, rusting, and cracking of fruit. So when I first get these plants in, sometimes it looks like a rust is all over, but that rust or powdery like orange substance is actually thousands of little mites. If in severe infestations, it can cause, like I said, cracking and rusting and bronzing of the fruit. And just to see what they look like up close, here's a very up close of these individual little yellow long mites, and again, eriophytes are these long worm-like mites. Lastly, pear rust mite. So this overwinters as an adult female in the bark of the trees, especially pears. I didn't mention, but most other mites will overwinter as eggs and hatch in the spring. They'll crawl the buds when they're beginning to develop, and they create what we call an erinium gall on the undersides of leaves. So erinium galls are basically the saliva causes kind of these rough patches to grow. They're not like a big ball like gall, but they're rough patches where the mites can hide in and access the tissue, and they're more like a felt almost. And there's a couple of erinium gall causing mites around on different hosts. Now, they will affect the leaves most of the time, but sometimes they do affect the fruit, going from the calyx out, and cause rusting on the pear fruit. So these are just a few of the examples. There's hundreds of important species of eriophyid mites that attack different types of plants. And again, some of them can actually look a lot like diseases or other disorders. So really looking for those mites could be key. Now, just to mention also, there are other mites on plants. Not all mites on plants are herbivores. If you see, for instance, if I get in a plant and I see a fast erratic mite in low densities, like one every leaf running around, they're actually typically the predatory mites, and they can be beneficials that feed on other mites. Others feed on spores, pollen, molds, and other associates to the plants, like these tideids below. These were on an azalea near the midrib, and again, they're not phytophagous. They're not something to be concerned with, but they are kind of sometimes difficult to tell apart from spider mites. Now, just a quick note about treatment. Treatment of mites is typically done with sulfur compounds. They're very sensitive to sulfur. In fact, pesticides, typical insecticides, can actually cause mites to explode in population because you kill a lot of the predators of the mites. So pyrethroids are one of the ones that are known to cause explosions in mites sometimes. Also, certain times of year and weather conditions can cause outbreaks of mites, either humid or dry, depending on the type of mite. Otherwise, it's really just knowing the specific type of mite and what the host is to figure out what the best treatment is. Okay, and you can always ask us if you have a specific issue for some information on that. Okay, moving on very quickly. One last thing I want to mention before we go into BOLO and get the mites part is that we had several samples of this small black beetle come up. One was last year. I had 3 this year coming into homes, being a little bit of a nuisance. People didn't know really what they were, and just want to make you be aware of this. This is a monkey beetle. I don't know why exactly they're called that. I know there's one in South Africa that's got these huge legs and stuff like that. But monkey beetle mayhem, but it's actually March hem or April hem because that's when they come out. This is Hoplia trivialis, a native scarab beetle. Body is about 6 to 8 millimeters long. Things to note when identifying it is that they have these very long legs with a single claw on the back, the hind leg. That's very atypical of scarabs. Also, the dark body with the lighter scales and seedy all over are going to be a good indication that you have this beetle. The adults are active in early spring, sometimes in large numbers where they mass emerge, and they'll feed on flowers and leaves, but I rarely see them being associated with pest status. Larvae in the soil where they feed on grasses and grass and other roots, just like many of the scarabs. I have not heard of them either being a pest issue. It seems to be that this is mostly a nuisance issue, getting into homes and bothering people. Okay. So lastly, a couple BOLOs, so things to be on the lookout for. So aphids and gall-making insects are their galls are starting to expand. They're becoming more noticeable. Lots of foliage feeders out. I saw at least one fall cankerworm. You see a few of them. They seem to be pretty low this year. If you're digging in the soil, planting a new garden, you'll find mature white grubs. Again, this time of year is when they're about to pupate and emerge as adults, as we'll see in a second. Social wasps are out and about. You'll see the large queens of many of these wasps that are out about to start a new colony. Scale crawlers, the scales are producing their crawlers, and this is a good time to treat. Bagworms in May and June are going to start coming out, and you'll have the very little ones that are more susceptible to insecticides. And lastly, a lot of young bugs, young assassin bugs and leaf-footed bugs are going to be hatching. May beetles are already starting to come to light. These brown beetles are more of a nuisance than an issue, but their cousins, the Japanese beetles, are going to be coming out around May, and obviously most of you know the issues caused by Japanese beetles. Vegetable pests are ramping up, and of course soon-to-be nuisances are the ticks and mosquitoes. So this time of year is really active. That's about it. So if you have any questions, maybe you can wait till later, and let's let Mike do his part.
All right, thank you, Matt. Could everyone give me a green check if you can hear me? All right, looks like we've got a quorum there. At least a couple dozen folks who can hear and are still tuned in. So thank you, Matt. I will take it from, I think, a couple of interesting things that happened recently. This is going to be the world record for the quickest turnaround in a sample coming in and appearing on Plants, Pests and Pathogens. We'll get to that in a moment, though. I want to start out with this sample, though, that isn't a sample. What do you say? I just want to make sure that the slide went to where I needed it.
I see hostas.
Okay, that's what I want you to see. So, not this past weekend, the weekend before, I was out with my wife at a couple of places that sell plants retail to the public, and there was one of them where I noticed a little ruffling on the leaf of some hostas there, and looked a little more closely, and there was kind of some model there, and I surreptitiously took a photo with my phone, my non-smartphone, and it didn't come out all that clearly, but you can sort of see here the Here's a nice ring spot there and some kind of wavy line patterns. And I am sure I resisted the temptation to bring a leaf back to the lab here, but I'm pretty sure that this is hosta virus X in these plants. Then at another location, later the same afternoon, I saw some similar but maybe less diagnostic symptoms on a hosta. So be sure to be on the lookout for, among other things, virus-infected plants, such as these hostas. The virus will not go away. It's systemic in the plant, and it could even spread to other hostas in your landscape. This is one of those like tobacco mosaic or tomato mosaic virus that are transmitted mechanically, so your weed eater or whatever that's spreading sap from one place to another can actually spread this around among your hostas. Fortunately, that is the only host of it. Another plant that you've got to watch out for as being very commonly infested or infected with viruses would be cannas. So caveat emptor, the buyer beware, and we've always talked about this in terms of your other transplants, your veggies that are being bought now. Make sure those are clean both in the foliage, the stems, and the roots. This is a sample that came in yesterday, and I looked at it quickly because I thought this is going to be good for plants, pests, and pathogens. And it's interesting because it's a little bit atypical, but does anybody think they recognize this? Type it into the chat box if you would. It's one of our classic diseases of leyland cypress. No takers. All right. Well, what would be some of the salient features you're looking for here? Very important in this situation is that you've got a genus as Cercospora. No, it is not Cercospora, and I'll show you an important difference. Not root rot either. Good. I'm glad folks are. Not that I'm glad that the agents are saying things that are not, but they bring up good points. The difference here is you've got a single point on the stem where the twig was girdled and it died from that point forward. If it were Cercospora, or actually Passiflora now, needle blight, then you would see the older needles dead and the very youngest ones still alive. It would be more generalized. If it were root rot, then you would see a more general kind of drying out, bronzing, yellowing, getting straw-colored of the foliage, and you wouldn't see that sharp transition zone, which if you look closely in these cases actually has quite a bit of resin there. So what we have here is actually a canker fungus that is girdling these twigs at that point, and this is our famous Ceridium canker of leyland cypress. The spores under the microscope are pretty impressive. They look like this when highly magnified, and those in today's rain are happily splashing around to new twigs, and the moisture is going to also allow them to then germinate and cause new infections. So we could be seeing more of this as time goes on. The symptoms are visible throughout the year because leyland, of course, being an evergreen. And the treatment is simply to prune these out. Go a couple inches into the clean foliage. Make sure you sanitize your shears frequently during the process because you can move the spores around on your shears as well. And insects are said to be vectors of the spores too. Next, I just want to jump into, jump into the BOLOs for the May-June period. And things are really starting to heat up. And one thing that we want to watch for on just about every plant in the landscape is going to be the two problems caused by none other than Homo sapiens, one being excess fertilizer, another being herbicide entry. Photographs here are of I believe it was a muscadine grape, but a grapevine. Muscadine is particularly sensitive to the auxin type, 2,4-D type herbicides, and you can see the kind of deformation there that you might confuse for a virus. Likewise, we do often see this problem with the crepe myrtles when the buds coming out turn out as just little clusters of very short buds like that. And those, in this case, that was suspected to be a case of either glyphosate and or an ALS inhibitor herbicide. And things are worse now than they were a decade or so ago because there are these glyphosate formulations that contain compounds like imazapyr which have residual effects. And so you get this kind of thing as a possible result if it leaches into the soil and reaches the roots of the plant. Let's see. Glyphosate itself, of course, causes this famous symptom on tomato, the lower portion of the leaflets turning a bright yellow, or it can even be a almost bleached look and turn some brown as well. Depending on the doses that the plant received, you may have recovery or you may have the loss of the exposed plant. But very classic symptom, glyphosate exposure on tomato. The BOLOs, the things we want to look for, the list is getting pretty long by this time of year. So in our ornamentals, you may be seeing still some cedar apple rust on the eastern red cedar. The galls there, I don't know if we'll see any teleo horns coming out with this rain. And then in June, next month, we'll start seeing the symptoms coming out on the apples, which I mentioned on the fruit slide. Leaf spot and anthracnose on maple, illustrated here on a Japanese maple in the bottom photograph. Then by the end of May, early June, we'll see quince rust causing these membranous, papery white structures coming out of the fruits that are releasing large quantities of the orange spores that will then go and infect the alternate host, the junipers. The black spotted rose, which you should be familiar with, of course, be on the lookout for that. Phytophthora root rot and armillaria root rot at any time of year. And rose rosette, as Matt mentioned. Now here, this is our record breaker. This sample came in around 9:30 this morning, and I slipped away during the presentation to go and take some pictures and then make some new slides to show this. So here we have some witch's broom, some of that proliferation of shoots there, but very little of the hyperthorniness that we usually associate with rose rosette. But there were a couple of other really key clues. One of them, and this is the earliest symptom that you'll see on an infected shrub, will be elongation of the new growth and the retention of the juvenile red color. Instead of turning green, as they should, the leaves remain that reddish color. So when you first see that, that's when you need to act. Another, and this is the worst case I've ever seen, or the most dramatic example, but another symptom of rose rosette is that a side shoot will be larger in diameter than the cane that it came off of. And like I say, it's not usually that dramatic, but this particular picture shows it quite well. Thanks for treatment. Let's see. Trying to check out the questions here. I guess that was for the other presenter. All right. Going back to our BOLO list here for May and June. In ornamentals, southern blight, especially on herbaceous perennials, once the weather really starts to get warm, you look for wilting, dying plants, and then in warm, moist weather, you'll see the mycelium here, the fungal growth, and the development then of the little sclerotia, which end up becoming about the size and shape and color of radish seeds, but they're actually survival structures of the fungus. Normal leaf drop on our hollies and magnolias. There was, in fact, an image sample submitted yesterday. Nelliar Stevens holly, leaves yellowing and falling off, and the comment that this seems to happen every spring. Well, yes, it does, because even though it's an evergreen, it doesn't mean that each leaf is immortal, and the plant will, after a couple of years of service, shed those leaves and it produces new ones. Powdery mildew will be cranking up now, as well as oak leaf blister, probably infecting as we speak, and if it hasn't done so already, causing the greenish blistering type symptom on the early leaves, and then eventually, as we get into June, turning brown, and it seems like it's expanding or causing more disease, but actually infection occurred quite a while back. It just gets more visible as the tissue dies. And nematodes, a constant problem, especially on boxwood, but sometimes in other ornamental landscape plants as well. Fruits, keep an eye out for peach leaf curl and peach scab as we get into the early part of the fruit-bearing season. On apple and pear, fire blight. And again, cedar apple rust showing up on the apples in June. Black rot on grape would be another thing to be looking for. On the veggies, bacterial spot of tomato and pepper, that's one you want to be careful of as you're buying your transplants, that you don't bring into the garden from the garden center. Tomato spotted wilt virus, root knot nematode, and as we get to late May and onward, be aware of the possibility of downy mildew of cucurbits and southern bacterial wilts. A couple of pictures here of downy mildews to be looking for. Cucumber on the left, basil in the middle. In fact, I talked to a grower just about 10 days ago who said they try and sell all their basil by July 4th because later in the summer it really becomes a problem, this downy mildew. And then pictured on grape on the far right. These do not infect the same host, though. Each of these is its own unique fungus. In general, this is the time of year we want to be looking out for tomato problems. The strongest part of the disease season in our tomatoes is going to be June, July, and the asterisks there represent the earliest occurrences on homegrown tomatoes that we've registered in the Plant Disease and Insect Clinic during the period 2008 to 2017. So starting early May will be the main season for, the beginning of the season for most of our diseases of tomato. Do note that even though early blight and late blight, they are different in terms of when they get started, maybe about a month's difference, but we actually see very little late blight in the home gardens, and there's a lot of overlap in the season of those two diseases despite the names. Oh, this is a slide out of place. Apologize for that. Impatiens are in the stores again, so we'll see if we get a repeat of the problems that we had several years ago with downy mildew. I expect that the fungicides used in production are going to give some residual benefit to the plants once they go out in the landscape, but in the long term, it will be very interesting to see how that plays out. Turf grasses, we already heard a lot about turf grasses today, but just to be aware that we're in the season for spring dead spot on Bermuda and zoysia as they're coming out of dormancy. Large patch of the warm season grasses, which is still under stress because of the cool temperatures. And then as we get warmer, the tall fescue becomes stressed and we'll get the brown patch. Rust can occur on multiple turf species and of course fairy rings on any kind of turf that we have. So I will turn it back over to Charlotte if she wants us to entertain questions or how she wants to handle it at this point.
All right, thank you. Yeah, I think we're at 12:04, but if we have a couple of questions, if anybody wants to put anything in the chat box, just as we wrap up, just a couple of questions.
I see Minda's question here about pull the plant from the landscape and rose rosette. Yes, that is still the recommendation because even though there is a certain possibility of pruning that cane out when you first detect it, if you go all the way to the ground, the probability of success drops quickly the longer it takes or longer time passes between when it occurs and when you detect it. So we would still recommend when you see rose rosette symptoms, remove that plant from the landscape. Will spring dead spots on Bermuda grass grow out? I'm not the turf specialist, but I believe that yes, if the turf is vigorous, that they will fill in those areas. And one thing I do remember Lee Butler telling me was that aeration, which is practiced, of course, more in athletic fields and professional turf, aeration really is a benefit against the spring dead spot, but it helps going into the next year because the infection actually occurs in the fall. So I would check out turf files for a little bit more information on that particular disease, actually.
All right, thank you, Mike, and thank you, Matt. Excellent as always. Just to remind everybody that our schedule for the rest of the year, the recordings are available online for February 27th and will be soon for today's webinar. Our next one will be June 19th, and that will be a little off the normal schedule of the fourth Tuesday where we had some conflict. So that's going to be the third Tuesday of the month. Then August 28th, we're going to learn about growing blueberries and finish up the year with the 23rd of October, and we will have representatives from the State Climate Office sharing climate and weather in the garden. Just want to show you really quickly gardening.ces.ncsu.edu. When I say the gardening portal or the NC State Extension gardening portal, this is the site I'm talking about, and this is where you can go find those recorded sessions. The easiest way is just to go up to the search window or the search bar and type in plants, pests, and pathogens. You'll be able to go to the page where the recordings and future dates for future sessions are posted. And then I hope to see you June 19th when we're back with our next Plants, Pests, and Pathogens to look at common soil issues and how to manage them. Our guest speaker will be Stephanie Drizal, who is a nutrient management specialist in Virginia, but also a graduate student at NC State in soil science. And she has developed materials for Master Gardener volunteer training in Virginia. And of course, I hope to see you at the North Carolina Extension Master Gardener Volunteer Association Conference in early June in Greenville. And look forward to meeting many of you there. And until we meet again, I just wish you all happy gardening.